Let's break down every single player that you could possibly need to add off of the waiver wire last minute going into week 6 of the 2024 fantasy football season to help bring home a dub. All right, let's kick the video off with Trey Sermon of the Colts, who will be looking to get his second start of the season with Jonathan Taylor continue to be sidelined dealing with that ankle injury. So we saw Sermon in relief of JT last week, walked away with 18.3 fantasy points against the Jaguars, 38 yards on the ground, a touchdown, and added 6 receptions off of 6 targets for 25 total receiving yards. So a nice double-digit fantasy day against a weak defense, I will say. I mean, arguably one of the weakest defenses, or maybe I should say arguably the weakest defense in the whole NFL. A little bit of a steeper matchup this week against the Titans, giving up the 13th fewest fantasy points to the running back position. Definitely a little bit different than the Jaguars last week, but Sermon is going to be the lead back here. I know we saw a little bit of involvement out of Tyler Goodson last week, and we'll probably get a little bit of involvement out of Goodson this week as well, but Sermon is going to be the RB1 with Jonathan Taylor out. I guess it's worth noting that Sermon is also coming off of a collarbone injury, but he has been removed from the injury report, so he's good to go. He's the RB1. Kind of surprised me, only sitting at 51% rostered. You need a running back to spot play for the week. Trey Sermon is atop of the list as we move into week 6. All right, next up we got Antonio Gibson of the New England Patriots, who is set to actually be the starter this week. We've got Ramondre Stevenson out. He's dealing with a foot injury, has officially been ruled out. So we do have Jermichael Hasty on this roster as well, but Gibson should act as the primary running back going into the week. Now, listen, I mean, we're looking for RB1 volume here, but once again, this isn't particularly a great matchup as the Texans are giving up the 10th fewest amount of fantasy points to the running back position, but we should get RB1 volume. I don't know exactly what we're going to get out of Drake May as the starter here at the quarterback position, moving from Jacoby Brissett to Drake May. How's it going to look for the Patriots? They are at home. The Texans defense hasn't been great on the season, but they do have a good front seven. We'll see, but Gibson with Stevenson out, who does have 2 double-digit fantasy performances on the season in weeks 2 and 4 of the year so far, is worth a shot if you're struggling at the position and you need somebody to fill in moving into week 6. All right, next up is Bucky Irving of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, who does sit at 65% roster, but this is a player with Rachaad White now listed as doubtful and not expected to start, who is dealing with a foot injury. This gives Bucky Irving a chance to really be the Bucky Irving that we've all been waiting for, right? So he's going to be the clear RB1 here. You do have some other names like Sean Tucker and Chase Edmonds on this roster, but this is going to be a Bucky Irving game on the road against the Saints. Once again, don't have a great matchup here as the Saints are allowing the 12th fewest total fantasy points to the running back position. So I do think that Irving will be in line for far more touches. When we look at the split over the last 2 weeks, we have about 10 touches to both White and Irving in the last 2 games. So we could definitely see 16, 17, 18 touches for Irving in this game. Now, Kareem Hunt just had a fantastic day in week 5 against the Saints defense. So we'll see how things shake out here. If Irving is available, I think he is definitely worth picking up and playing if you need to in week 6. Next up is Tyrone Tracy of the New York Giants, a popular ad last week and a popular ad this week. We've got Devin Singletary listed as questionable. I've heard some different reports about Singletary playing this week or not playing as he deals with that groin injury. There are some people who do believe Singletary will play. That will impact Tracy's overall volume in either direction here. But I do believe that Tyrone Tracy can have a good fantasy outing even if Singletary does play. I've been saying this all week long. You go back and you look at what Tyrone Tracy did in that start last week against Seattle, off of 18 touches, 129 yards on the ground. Looked very good overall when he was getting the opportunities and looked much better than Eric Gray, who had a lost fumble in that matchup against Seattle. So Tracy, who had 14 fantasy points last week, I still think is worth picking up and potentially starting, also because there's a home game for the Giants and they get the Cincinnati Bengals, allowing the 21st most fantasy points to the running back position. This Bengals defense is awful. I mean, just absolutely awful. Bottom 10 against every position in fantasy football right now. So I like Tracy. Might not see RB1 volume if Singletary plays, but I think there's reason either way with Singletary's health to start Tyrone Tracy in week 6. Right, next up is Roschon Johnson of the Chicago Bears, and this is a player that I've been talking about throughout the week. He has 2 double-digit performances in his last 3 games. He has 3 touchdowns in his last 3 games, and he sits at just 38% rostered. A smash matchup this week against the Jacksonville Jaguars. And yes, DeAndre Swift is going to be the RB1 this weekend, but this matchup with the Jaguars giving up the 26 most fantasy points to the position is just too good to ignore. You look at what the Bears running backs have done in the last 3 weeks against 3 really bad run defenses in the Colts, Rams, and the Panthers. And like I said, Roschon Johnson has 3 touchdowns in that stretch. He has 2 touchdowns in his last game against the Panthers. And I know this is still not as bad as the Panthers run defense, but it's very close. This is a really bad Jaguars defense overall. The Bears are giving Roschon Johnson goal line touches, and I don't think that's going to change in this matchup. I think he's a good handcuff to DeAndre Swift. And, you know, the matchups after the week 7 bye week are still not that bad. Washington, Arizona, New England. So there's still going to be opportunities for these Bears running backs as the season goes on. And I think that Roschon Johnson will continue to get some of that goal line work. So Roschon Johnson, you need kind of a desperation play. Maybe the ceiling's not so high. He definitely has a chance to score in this matchup against the Jaguars. Matter of fact, I feel so good about Roschon Johnson that I would head over to Underdog and take the over on him to score a rushing or a receiving touchdown. 3 touchdowns in the last 2 games against really soft run defenses. Another soft run defense. I think this week, I think he can absolutely hit this line. And don't forget, all new users who sign up with promo code TheCatch are going to get a free Joe Burrow over half of a total yard to use towards Sunday's action. That link is down below. Take your free Joe Burrow pick 'em, pair it with Roschon Johnson to score a touchdown and automatically triple your cash entry. And while you are doing that, Underdog is going to give you a 50% deposit match up to $1,000 when you sign up with promo code TheCatch. That link is down below. Next up, we've got Ray Davis of the Buffalo Bills. And there is an argument for Ty Johnson here as well. You got Ray Davis at 16% rostered, Ty Johnson at just 7% rostered. But James Cook is listed as questionable, and he's not expected to play, at least according to most reports out there, as he deals with a foot and toe injury. I mean, this has just been the story of this football season, just injuries popping up out of nowhere. Great stud players, but I digress. Who's it going to be? Ty Johnson, Ray Davis, who gets the most touches here? You could take your own guess, and Ty Johnson has had a couple, moments so far on the season. Now, Ray Davis has 7 or more rushing attempts in 3 of the last 4 games, and I just liked Ray Davis a lot as a prospect coming into the season. They get the Jets. It is on Monday Night Football, so we might have to kind of hold out here. It's not a great matchup. Unfortunately, for a lot of these spot plays at running back this week, just not a lot of great matchups. The Jets giving up the 8th fewest fantasy points to the running back position. But if you're desperate, you need someone last minute, I do think that Ray Davis could come out of this matchup with a decent stat line, but the ceiling is definitely limited. Now, the thing you also want to consider here is that maybe there's a chance that James Cook misses some additional time. It's a really good stretch after week 6. The Titans, the Seahawks, the Dolphins, the Colts, in the next 4 matchups after this Monday Night Football game against the Jets. So I don't know if I'm expecting James Cook to miss that much time, but if he does miss time, then these Bills running backs are certainly worth stashing. If you're desperate for points here in week 6, I think Ray Davis is worth a shot on Monday Night Football. I just want to mention the Texans running backs. This is a confusing situation because we're getting a lot of reports that Joe Mixon was probably not going to play in week 6. And now we have reports saying that he is trending towards making a return. If he does not play, however, it is a good matchup for the Texans running backs against the New England Patriots. Now, in the past 3 weeks or so, We've talked about Dare and Goombawale. We've talked about Cam Akers. But now what makes it a little bit confusing is Dameon Pierce is off of the injury report. He had been dealing with a hamstring injury, but he's good to go. So now I think this is a little bit of a debacle when we're looking at how is this volume going to be spread out. Is Dameon Pierce going to get, a fair amount of touches in his return? Is he going to get close to zero? How relevant is Cam Akers, who's been serviceable at best in the last 3 weeks? And I think either way, Dare Goombawale can end up with some receiving work regardless of if Joe Mixon's healthy or Dameon Pierce gets volume or not. I think he does have a unique skill set in the pass game. So Dare is actually the running back that I like the best here. But I think for me, this is a stay away situation. It is a good matchup on the road for the Texans against the Patriots. We'll see if Joe Mixon ends up being healthy. I will say if you're desperate for points, there's an opportunity here. But regardless, it looks like Mixon should be good to go by week 7 at worst. So I think Dare is the best pickup because he has that skill set in the receiving game where we haven't quite seen that out of Cam Akers, and we don't really know what to expect out of Dameon Pierce and his return here. So I'm staying away for the most part from the Texans running backs, but I felt like I needed to mention them because I've seen Dare picked up in a lot of leagues, and I've seen Dameon Pierce in the last 24, 48 hours picked up in a lot of leagues as well. And Cam Akers kind of the odd man out as his ceiling has just been pretty low in relief of Joe Mixon, but he also sits at 32% rostered. So we'll see what happens. And maybe Joe Mixon does play in week 6 and this is pointless, but I felt like I needed to mention the Texans running backs as we approach week 6. Let's move on to the wide receiver position, and let's start things with Darius Slayton, who I'm excited to talk about as he sits at 19% rostered. I did have him on the early waiver wire video that came out Monday morning for you guys. And this was the scenario we talked about. Like it's likely, it was my viewpoint, at least when I recorded that video this past Sunday night, that Malik Neighbors is good to go for week 6, but he is not going to play due to that concussion that he suffered in week 4 at the end of the game on Thursday Night Football against Dallas. So this is a fantastic matchup. Obviously, if Rondell Robinson, who sits at 79% rostered now, is available in your league, who has double-digit fantasy points in every game except for week 2 against Washington, where he at least still scored a touchdown, is available. You should pick up Robinson. He's a great play. But Slayton is a good play too, and mainly because we look at this matchup against the Bengals, while they do sit as the team allowing the 12th fewest fantasy points to wide receivers, it still feels like a great matchup because I don't care. I don't think anything of this Bengals defense right now. It just got absolutely torched by Jamar Chase and T. Higgins. Now, no offense, Rondell Robinson and Darius Slayton, you're not exactly T. Higgins and Jamar Chase, but this is another good opportunity at home for the Giants. I like the Giants offense a lot this week, actually, to come out here and have some solid fantasy outings for their primary skill position players. 26.2 fantasy points in week 5 for Slayton with Neighbors out. 11 targets, 8 receptions, 122 receiving yards, and a touchdown on the road against a better defense in Seattle. So Slayton sits at 19% rostered. You need a good spot play, someone to plug in last minute. Darius Slayton is probably my top choice as we approach week 6. All right, another player that I really like going into the week is Jalen Tolbert of the Dallas Cowboys, sitting at 49% rostered, so a little bit higher overall on the roster percentage. He has double digits in 3 out of his last 4 matchups, 2 touchdowns in 2 of the last 3 games for Jalen Tolbert. Now he gets the Detroit Lions. And, this offense has played defense has played a little bit better in terms of their secondary, but they're giving up the 27th most fantasy points to the wide receiver position. And they tend to play a little bit worse against kind of slot type wide receivers or wide receiver 2. So I think this is a smash play for Jalen Tolbert going into week 6. I think if you're looking to fill a flex spot and he's out there and available, he should be scooped up right away. I'm expecting points in this matchup between the Lions and the Cowboys. It's a home game for the Cowboys. I just like everything about Jalen Tolbert this week. I think he is set for a very solid outing. 9 or more targets in 2 of the last 4 games. Good chemistry with Dak Prescott. There's nothing to dislike about Jalen Tolbert. going into week 6. If he's available, pick him up, throw him in the flex with confidence. All right, another week, another video where I talk about Allen Lazard sitting at 52% rostered. He has double-digit fantasy points in every game on the season except for week 2. He's averaging 13.6 fantasy points so far on the year, and in total, he has 4 touchdowns. He is also the wide receiver 23 on the season so far. It's not a great matchup this week against the Bills. They're giving up the 3rd fewest fantasy points to the wide receiver position, but they got to apply that defensive pressure to Garrett Wilson's and Devontae Adams. I'm kidding. they've got to apply that defensive pressure to Garrett Wilson. And I think that this Bills run defense is so bad that they're going to have a really tough time. We're going to have to kind of focus on Breece Hall and Braylon Allen. But Allen Lazard is just one of these guys like, yeah, the ceiling's not super high. We haven't seen that high ceiling that we saw in week 1 since week 1. But if you need to plug someone in and if he's out there and available, he's probably going to have a good shot to give you double-digit fantasy points. Not a great matchup this week, so I'm not as enthusiastic as I was last week about picking up Allen Lazard and actually playing him if you needed some sneaky value. He did come through with 13.4 fantasy points. Should have had 2 touchdowns in that game, but just had the 1. But I do think that Allen Lazard is a good start if he's out there and available and you need someone to throw in. Once again, he's a wide receiver 23. There's only 22 wide receivers right now in fantasy football who have more fantasy points than Allen Lazard. He's worth a shot as we approach week 6. All right, next up is Alec Pierce of the Colts. And this is an interesting situation because I think about a day or so ago, he would have probably made the top of the wide receiver list because we weren't expecting Michael Pittman to play, who's dealing with a back injury. And I think most of us were expecting Pittman to go to the IR. But now it looks as if Michael Pittman has logged a full practice and he's going to try and play through that back injury. So this is kind of a hard one, right? We've got Josh Downs also questionable with a toe injury, but it looks as of right now that Josh Downs and Michael Pittman are going to try and play. There's an argument for A.D. Mitchell in this mix as well, who walked away with 4 receptions, 38 receiving yards off of 7 targets, and 9.1 fantasy points last week. But I guess my point being is that even if Pittman and Downs are out there and playing, I think Downs is probably going to be good to go, but how close to full health is Michael Pittman actually? Is going to be my question, right? And at the same time, Alec Pierce has a lot of volatility. I mean, he's the wide receiver 11 right now in full PPR. Yes, that is real. But he has more than 3 targets in 1 game on the season. Does have good chemistry with Richardson. I think Richardson's going to get the start this week. It looks like he's going to be healthy. We'll find out if it's Flacco or Richardson. I'm not as worried about that part. There's some volatility with Alec Pierce, who had 22.4 fantasy points last week, 3 targets, 3 receptions, 134 receiving yards, and a touchdown. He's a home run hitter type of wide receiver. There's value here. It is a tough matchup. Believe it or not, Tennessee has given up the fewest fantasy points to the wide receiver position so far on the season. So kind of look at this. If Pittman is out there, is he actually fully healthy? Is he more of a decoy? How does that impact Alec Pierce potentially in this game? I guess without Pittman, we were expecting more volume to Pierce, who I've seen just get picked up across the leagues, shooting up to 40% rostered. It was much lower roster to start the week. We'll see what happens, but there's definitely some value in Alec Pierce either way going into week 6. All right, next wide receiver I'm going to talk about is Ray Mccloud of the Falcons, and I've talked about Ray throughout the week. It's a great matchup on the road here against Carolina. I'm expecting points from this Falcons offense. I don't think it's going to be as competitive as last week's game against the Bucks. Don't think we're going to see, 500 passing yards out of Kirk Cousins, but it's a great matchup. The Panthers giving up the 24th most fantasy points to the wide receiver position. They're awful against the run. They're poor against quarterbacks and tight ends. Ray Mccloud quietly has 11.2 or more fantasy points in his last 2 games, 6 receptions, and 7 or more targets in his last 2 games. So he sits at 28% roster. This is a player that you can scoop up, throw in your lineup, averaging 9.2 fantasy points per game. And maybe you don't get a high ceiling, but you certainly get a pretty safe floor. So maybe this is a deeper league play, But I do think that Ray Mccloud, who hasn't scored a touchdown on the season, has a shot to score a touchdown against the Panthers. So you need someone to plug and play, get you some points. I think Ray Mccloud against the Panthers definitely gives you a safe floor as we approach week 6. Next up is Xavier Hutchinson of the Texans, who's moving up the depth chart because, unfortunately, we are seeing Nico Collins head to IR. So, yes, this is going to mean more volume, more targets for Stephon Diggs, more volume and more targets for Tank Dell, and probably more volume and more targets for Dalton Schultz and maybe one of those running backs we talked about earlier. But Xavier Hutchinson now comes in as the wide receiver 3, who kind of plays in similar fashion to the style of Nico Collins. So pretty high in terms of his snap percentage last week at 71%. 3 targets, 2 receptions, 31 receiving yards, 5.1 fantasy points. Nothing crazy here. Nothing crazy by any stretch, but this is a good offense. We all know that. We got CJ Stroud at quarterback. It's a good matchup against the Patriots. They're going to have to put all of their defensive pressure, Christian Gonzalez, on Stephon Diggs. Probably more likely that Tank Dell goes off finally in this game. But Hutchinson, over the next couple weeks, with no Nico Collins, sitting at just 16% rostered, is certainly worth picking up because if he starts to carve out a role, good matchup in week 7 against the Packers, good matchup in week 8 against the Colts, tough against the Jets in week 9, good matchup against the Lions in week 10. So while Nico Collins is out for the next couple weeks, Hutchinson could certainly build a role in this offense and be a part of one of the better passing attacks in the NFL. So Xavier Hutchinson probably out there just 16% rostered. I don't know if I want to start him here in week 6, but he's certainly worth picking up last minute as we approach the week. The last wide receiver that I want to talk about is Jalen Polk of the New England Patriots. And I do think there's an argument for Demario Douglas here as well, who sits at 13% rostered. But essentially what we have is we have a new quarterback for the Patriots, and that's rookie Drake May. This could be disastrous in this first start. Could be okay. Could be good. We don't know. This offensive line for the Patriots is still awful, and it is still not a great room of skill set players. Plus, Ramondre Stevenson's going to miss this game. We'll see what happens here, but I do believe in that kind of rookie-to-rookie chemistry when we see a wide receiver and quarterback come into the league in the same year. Jalen Polk has shown some flashes. Hasn't really put it all together, has no more than 9.2 fantasy points in a single game on the season. But I do like Jalen Polk right now, and I do think he's worth a shot. He sits at just 19% roster, like I said, so certainly worth rostering. The Patriots will get the Jaguars in week 7, but they don't really have a lot of good matchups coming up here. You know, the Jets in week 8, the Titans in week 9, the Bears in week 10. They do have a nice stretch weeks 11 through weeks 15 with the Rams, Dolphins, Colts, a bye week, and then the Cardinals. But it might be a tough couple weeks for the Patriots. But I always say, bad offenses still produce good fantasy players. So there's going to be somebody who potentially emerges as a number 1 wide receiver here because we know they're going to want to throw the football with Drake May at quarterback. It's probably going to be some growing pains here. Whether it's good or bad, there's going to be somebody at the wide receiver position worth rostering. So you can make an argument for Demario Douglas. Right now, my argument is for Jalen Polk going into week 6. We'll see if that changes. I want to give you guys 1 quarterback and 1 tight end. And my top quarterback is actually going to be Danny Dimes. 26% rostered. It's a good matchup. We've talked about this matchup throughout the video so far. The Bengals are giving up the 29th most fantasy points to the quarterback position. Great matchup. Lowly roster quarterback. And Daniel Jones, the QB 14 right now in fantasy football. He has 18 or more fantasy points in 3 out of 5 matchups so far on the season, coming off of a game where he had 22 fantasy points, 2 touchdowns, 257 passing yards through the air, and 38 yards on the ground last week. And most importantly, for Daniel Jones, no interceptions. So I'll keep it short here. Great matchup for Daniel Jones. He hasn't been as bad as some people are thinking. Going into week 6, he's lowly rostered. If you need someone to stream, I do like Daniel Jones. Caleb Williams has a great matchup against the Jaguars as well. He's a little bit higher rostered at 66%. Caleb Williams, Daniel Jones, Those are my two names if you need a quarterback to stream last minute going into week 6. I want to give you guys one tight end as well. That's going to be Zach Ertz of the Washington Commanders. And I'll keep this one short as well. Zach Ertz sits at 37% rostered, and it's kind of been one of these guys that has been a streaming option, has been picked up, has been dropped across leagues, but this is a great matchup against the Baltimore Ravens, giving up the 26 most fantasy points to the tight end position so far on the season. And Zach Ertz has been kind of a floor play. I don't think his ceiling's super high. And I know he's coming off of a bad week with just 3 fantasy points against the Browns, but he did have 8 targets in that matchup. So this is just all about the matchup this week against the Ravens. The fact that the Washington Commanders offense has absolutely been humming, has looked fantastic. High volume last week, just didn't quite come through with the receptions. So still averaging 7 fantasy points per game. Nice floor play if you just need somebody to pick up and throw in last minute. A higher rostered player that I like as well at the tight end position is Dalton Schultz, sitting at 67% rostered. We've already talked about this Texans offense and Nico Collins and everything. He should be in line for more overall volume. He had 6.4 or more fantasy points in his last 2 matchups. Once again, not a high ceiling play, but Zach Ertz, Dalton Schultz, the 2 guys that I think you may be able to go out and add as we approach week 6 if you need tight end help. That'll do it for today's video. There's every single running back, every single wide receiver, and a quarterback and tight end that you can pick up last minute to help you guys bring home a dub here in week 6. Don't forget, guys, I'm answering all fantasy football questions in the comment section down below. If you guys need anything whatsoever moving into week 6, make sure to drop a comment. I'll answer every single comment before Sunday's slate of games kicks off. And don't forget, guys, we got everything here on the channel that you could possibly need for week 6 of 2024 fantasy football. Start sets at every single position, players that you can't bench because they're going to go off, buy low, targets, must start kickers, must start defenses, everything that you guys could need, as well as live fantasy Q&A streams throughout the week. So make sure you guys are subscribed so that you don't miss out on any of the content. And with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.